Hello! Welcome! If you enjoy these stories, please check that you are following, and drop a comment where you're listening from. It's a small way to contribute and tell the algorithm to recommend my stories to more people like you. Thank you dearly. In the summer of 1789, a single ship set out from England carrying more than 200 banished women on a journey that would take nearly a year to complete. But this was no ordinary prison transport. It was a voyage defined by its long, deliberate stops in the great harbours of 4 continents, where the vessel effectively transformed into a floating brothel, servicing sailors, merchants, and locals at every port of call around the globe. Behind the scandal was a story of survival, where women traded the only currency they had left to secure their passage, their comfort, and their future at the very edge of the earth. Tonight we are going to sail with them. Picture a low, close space below the deck of a ship at anchor. The air warm and thick, smelling of tar and bilge water and the river beyond. There is an anvil here, small and worn, and a man leaning over it with a hammer in his hand. In front of him, held out toward the light of a single lantern, is a woman's ankle, and around that ankle is a band of black iron riveted shut, not locked, riveted, hammered closed by a country blacksmith weeks ago, in some jail far inland, and meant to stay closed until someone with a hammer and a good eye should take it off again. That someone is the ship's cooper, a Scotsman named John Nichol. For every woman brought aboard still in her chains, the country jailers paid him half a crown to knock the rivets loose. It was ordinary work. He had struck 100 such irons. He set the flat of his chisel against the soft head of the rivet, and he brought the hammer down once, twice, and the band sprang open, and the weight of it fell away from the woman's leg and rang against the deck. And in that small, ordinary moment, something happened to him that he could not explain then and could not explain 50 years later, when he was an old man dictating the story to a stranger. He looked up from the fallen iron at the face above it. Pale, tired, quiet, and in his own plain words, he fixed his fancy upon her from the moment he knocked the rivet out of her irons upon his anvil, as firmly as he ever resolved anything in his life. He resolved, standing there, to bring her back to England when her sentence was served, his lawful wife. He did not yet know her name. Around this one small forge, this one struck rivet, a whole strange voyage was waiting to unfold, a ship the world would remember, more than a century after everyone aboard her was dead. By a lurid 2-word name, it would never once have called itself the Floating Brothel. A ship of women sent to seed a starving colony at the bottom of the world. A ship that would stop in the great harbours of 4 continents and become, for a few weeks in each, the most talked about thing on the water. But that is the world's version, the one that fits on a page. The man at the anvil never knew any of it by that name. He knew only the woman whose iron he had just struck away, and the years he would spend afterward. An old sailor wandering at last the streets of the city he had left as a boy, going down once all the way to Lincoln to make inquiry after her. No one there had heard of her. What became of her? Whether she was living or dead? Well, let that question hang there in the dark for a moment. We are not going to answer it yet. Instead, we are going back to the beginning. Back before the anvil, before the iron, before he ever laid eyes on her. To a summer when England had a problem it did not know how to solve, and a ship that no one had ever quite seen the likes of before. Welcome, Nightlings. This is Huxley. If you like listening or falling asleep to real stories that will reveal life's deeper truths, then this is the place for you. Consider subscribing and let the next story find you when you need it most. We are close towards a milestone for this little channel. 500 followers. It is not much, I know, but it is progress, and I cannot get there without your help. So, if you have thoroughly enjoyed one of my episodes, share it with a friend who needs it. Follow if you have not. It matters more than it should. Thank you. Now, find a comfortable place to sit or lay down. Dim the lights. Turn your notifications off and put your phone out of reach. And let's begin. In the year 1789, in the crowded reach of the River Thames below London, a ship lay at anchor and slowly filled with women. She was not a large ship, though she was a handsome one. 3 masts, some 400 tons, built years before in the shipyards of Whitby in the north, where they knew how to make a hull that could take a beating from the sea and come home again. She had carried cargo in her time, ordinary cargo, the barrels and bales that ships carry. But in the summer of 1789, she had been chartered by the British government for a purpose unlike any she had served before, and unlike almost any ship had served before her. She was to be loaded from stem to stern with convict women, only women, and she was to carry them to the very bottom of the world. Her name was the Lady Juliana. To understand why such a ship existed at all, you have to understand a problem England had made for itself, quietly, over many years. The kind of problem a country creates without ever deciding to, and then wakes up one day unable to ignore. For most of the 18th century, England had dealt with its convicted criminals in a way that was brutally simple. If you stole, and if the thing you stole was worth more than a shilling or 2, the law could hang you for it. There were, by one accounting, more than 200 crimes on the books that carried the sentence of death, a body of law so freely lethal that later generations would call it, plainly, the bloody code. But judges and juries were not, on the whole, monsters, and they balked at hanging a half-starved girl for taking a length of cloth or a child for taking a loaf. And so, again and again, they reached for the other great punishment the age had invented: transportation, beyond the seas, out of sight, for 7 years, for 14, for life. For decades, that had meant America. Before the colonies broke away, England had shipped something on the order of 50,000 convicts across the Atlantic, sold their labor to plantations and farms, and washed its hands of them. It was for the government a tidy arrangement. The convict vanished over the horizon and became someone else's difficulty. And then, in 1783, the American Revolution ended, and the door slammed shut. The new United States had no interest in receiving England's prisoners. Almost overnight, England had nowhere to put the people it had condemned, so they piled up in the county jails and above all in the rotting hulks of old warships moored in the Thames and at Portsmouth, dismasted, going soft with rot, packed with men and women chained below the waterline. The hulks were meant to be temporary. They festered for years, and still the courts kept handing down their sentences of transportation to a place that no longer existed. You have to let yourself feel for a moment what those places were, because the women of the Lady Juliana came out of them. A prison hulk was a dead ship, a warship too old and too tired to sail, stripped of her masts, left to sit and swell in the river mud. Below her decks, where cannon had once stood, they packed the condemned, hundreds of bodies in the dark and the damp, breathing the same foul air, chained at night, riddled with fever and vermin, listening to the tide slap against a hull that would never move again. And the county jails inland were often no better. Cramped stone rooms where the poor waited, sometimes for years, on the word transportation attached to their names, with no ship to carry them and nowhere for a ship to go. This was the holding pattern of a whole class of English people, forgotten, chained, and waiting for a door at the far side of the world to open. When at last the Lady Juliana was fitted out, the order went round to empty those jails and those hulks of their women, and to bring them down to her. And so, through the long months she lay in the river, they came aboard in their irons, a few at a time, out of the rot and the dark, blinking into the strange half-freedom of a ship that was actually going somewhere. The answer, when it finally came, was audacious to the point of madness. If there was no old colony to send the convicts to, England would use them to build a new one, on the other side of the earth, in a bay that a naval lieutenant named James Cook had mapped not 20 years before, on the eastern coast of a continent almost no European had seen. Botany Bay, New South Wales. A place so distant that the voyage there took the better part of a year, and a letter home might not return for 2. It is hard now to feel how enormous that distance truly was in an age of sail. We can cross the world in a day and speak to the far side of it in a heartbeat, and so the word far has gone soft on us. But to the people of 1789, New South Wales was very nearly the moon. It lay at the end of the longest sea road on Earth, down the whole length of the Atlantic, around the storms at the bottom of Africa, and across thousands of miles of the empty Southern Ocean, where for weeks together there was nothing at all but wind and grey water. To be sent there was, for all practical purposes, to be sent off the edge of the known world. No one who went expected, in any real way, to come back. A sentence of transportation to Botany Bay was not a prison term with a door at the end of it. It was a kind of erasure. a way of making a human being simply disappear from the country that had condemned them as completely as if they had died. Except that somewhere, unimaginably far away, they went on living. It was into that erasure that more than 200 women were about to be gathered and sent. In 1787, the first fleet had sailed. 11 ships, some 750 convicts, men and women both, under a careful naval officer named Arthur Phillip. They landed in January of 1788, moved a little way north to a fine deep harbour, Phillip named Sydney Cove, and there, on a strip of unfamiliar shore, planted a ragged, hungry, and altogether uncertain settlement, the first European foothold on the continent and a claim to the whole of it. But there was a flaw in the new colony, built into it from the very first day, and it was this. It was a colony almost entirely of men. Among those first convicts, the men outnumbered the women by something like 4 to 1. A settlement of men alone does not become a society. It does not put down roots. It does not raise the next generation. If Botany Bay was going to be anything more than a garrison and a dumping ground, if it was going to become a place where people were born and buried and married and stayed, then it needed women. A great many women. And it needed them soon. And so we arrive at the strange, cold logic that built the Lady Juliana. Somewhere in the offices of the Home Department, the problem of England's overflowing women's jails and the problem of the colony's missing women were set down side by side, and someone saw that each was the answer to the other. Empty the jails, fill a ship, send the women south. It was framed, where it was framed at all, as policy. As the practical business of supplying a distant settlement with what it lacked. No one in those offices would have said aloud what the arrangement plainly was, that these women, sentenced for the smallest of crimes, were being posted to the far side of the world to become the mothers of a nation none of them had chosen. The men who ran the empire did not call them founders, but that is what they intended them to be. The women themselves knew none of this grand design. They knew only that they had been condemned, and that they were being taken down to the river and put aboard a ship, and that the ship was bound for a place at the edge of every map they had ever seen, if they had ever seen a map at all. Who were they? That is the question the whole voyage will answer, slowly, one face at a time. For now, at the very start, they are still what the paperwork made them. A number. A cargo. More than 200 women gathered from the jails of England, waiting in the belly of a ship in the Thames, listening to the strange new sounds of a vessel readying for sea. But every one of those 200 had a name and a story, and a reason she was there that would not fit in any ledger. And there was one man aboard who would come to know a great many of those stories, who would look at that hold full of the condemned and see, instead of cargo, a crowd of particular human beings, and who would set it all down, decades later, so that we could know them too. before we meet the women, we should meet him. His name was John Nichol, and by the summer of 1789, he had already lived about 3 ordinary lifetimes' worth of the world. He had been born in 1755 in the little village of Curry, some 6 miles out from Edinburgh in the low green country of the Scottish lowlands. His mother had died when he was very young, died in childbed, leaving his father with 5 children to raise alone. His father was a cooper, a maker of barrels, and a man Nichol remembered with real respect. A man of talent and information, someone who knew things and could do things with his hands. In the age before machines, the cooper was a quietly essential craftsman. Everything that had to be stored or shipped, water, salt beef, flour, wine, gunpowder, travelled in wooden casks, and those casks had to be built tight enough to hold the sea out and the contents in. It was a good trade, and young John was apprenticed to it, and he learned it well. It is the reason that 30 years later, and half a world from home, he would be able to strike the iron off a woman's ankle and mend a leaking flour cask on a Brazilian wharf with the same practiced hands. But the boy did not want barrels. From his earliest memory, John Nichol wanted only one thing, and he stated it in the very first lines of his life story with a kind of rueful honesty. The first wish he ever formed was to wander. He had read Robinson Crusoe many times over, until the longing to be at sea had settled into his bones and would not leave. He gave his poor parents many an anxious search as a boy, chasing that wandering passion. And when he was old enough, he went, and the sea gave him in full measure exactly what he had asked for. Consider only what he had already done before he ever heard the name Lady Juliana. As a young man, he had gone into the Royal Navy and served through the long war with the American colonies, some 7 years of it, aboard the men of war of that age. The crash of the guns, the blockades, the boredom and terror of a wooden warship at sea. When that war ended, he did not come ashore for long. He shipped north instead, all the way to the ice of Greenland, aboard a whaler, into a white and silent world at the top of the earth, hunting the great whales in freezing water. He worked the sugar islands of the West Indies, in the heat and the fever country of the Caribbean. And then, most remarkable of all, he had gone round the whole world once already. A long trading voyage to the South Seas and China, aboard a ship called the King George, a voyage that carried him clear around the globe. He had seen the Hawaiian Islands that Captain Cook had reached only a few years before. He had beaten around the bottom of South America, through the wild grey seas of Cape Horn, where the wind never stops and the waves stand up like moving hills. He had crossed the whole immense width of the Pacific and come home again by way of China. By the time this story begins, John Nichol was a 34-year-old man who had already put a girdle round the entire earth, and who would, before his life was done, circle it once more. Think of what that means for a moment. Here was a barrel maker's son from a village 6 miles outside Edinburgh, a man of no fortune and no name, who had nonetheless seen more of the actual surface of the planet than almost any king or scholar of his age. He had stood in tropical surf and on polar ice. He had watched islands he had no words for rise out of strange seas. He had every reason to be restless forever, for the world had shown him just enough of itself to keep him always wanting the next horizon. And that is precisely the point to hold on to, because it is the key to everything that happens to him aboard the Lady Juliana. A man who has seen the whole world and been held by none of it is not a man you would expect to be stopped in his tracks permanently by a single quiet face below the decks of a convict ship. And yet that is exactly what is about to happen to him. It is that voice, the voice of a man who had seen a great deal and been humbled by most of it, that makes his account of the Lady Juliana so precious and so unlike any official record. He was humane. He was curious about everyone he met. He was dryly, gently funny, even about himself and his own failings, which he never troubled to hide. He was easily moved. A man who could be reduced to tears by another person's suffering, and who, on the very same voyage, could laugh out loud at the antics of a woman in a barrel. That blend is rare, and it is the exact temperature of this whole story. Real compassion, warmed through with a sailor's plain good humor. There is a detail about how he came to be aboard at all that is almost too fitting to be true, and yet it is. Nicol had, just before this, come home to Scotland half decided to settle down for good, to hang up the sea, take up the cooper's trade in earnest, and be an ordinary land-bound man at last. And then a letter came from an old captain he had sailed with, and, as he put it, it upset all his future plans and rekindled his wandering ways with as much force as ever. He almost stayed home. He very nearly did not go. And here is the part that gives the whole thing its quiet ache. When the berth aboard the Lady Juliana was offered to him, he did not want it. Not for the reason you might think, but because of who she was carrying. He did not, by his own admission, care at all for her cargo. A ship full of convict women was not the adventure he had in mind. He took the place anyway, and he tells us exactly why. Only to see the new country, to lay his own eyes on this strange settlement at the bottom of the world that everyone was talking of. To see New South Wales, he was willing to put up with a great deal. So the man who would fall in love on this voyage, who would find on this ship the one attachment that outlasted every other in his long wandering life, boarded her reluctantly, half wishing he had stayed by his own fireside in Scotland, and expecting nothing from the women below decks but trouble and noise. he came aboard as her steward as it happened, almost by accident. The appointed steward had gotten himself drunk and deserted before the ship could sail, and Nicholl the cooper stepped into the empty post. It was a stroke of luck disguised, as such things often are, as an inconvenience. And pause on how thin the thread is there. If a stranger, some other man, whose name we will never know, had not gone off on a drunk and abandoned his post at exactly the right moment, John Nicholl would have remained only the cooper. He would have struck the irons off the women's ankles for his half-crown a head and gone back to his barrels, and moved among 200 lives the way a workman moves through a crowd, and he would very likely never have come to know a single one of them, never learned their stories, never fallen in love, never carried this whole lost world home in his memory, to be written down 30 years later. Everything you are hearing tonight hangs, in part, on one anonymous man's bad night with a bottle. It is a strange thing to be grateful for. And yet, 2 centuries on, here we are, grateful for it. For the steward's duties would carry him among the women daily, issuing their provisions, keeping their stores, moving through their world in a way an ordinary crewman never would. If he had stayed only the cooper, he might have struck their irons and never learned their names. As steward, he could not help but come to know them. And what he found, when at last he looked, really looked, at the 200 condemned women in his charge, was not at all what he had been told to expect. That is where we are going next. But first, we have to understand what these women had actually done to earn a one-way passage to the end of the earth. Because when you set their crimes beside their sentences, something in the arithmetic of it will not sit right. And it did not sit right with John Nicholl either. Let us do the arithmetic then plainly, and without hurrying it, because the plainness is the whole point. There was a young woman aboard named Sarah Whitlam. She came from Lincoln, in the flat green fen country of eastern England, and she had been sentenced to 7 years' transportation. 7 years, carried to the far side of the world. For a mantle. A cloak. She said, and there is no reason on earth to doubt her, that she had borrowed it from a woman she knew, and that the woman had then turned around and prosecuted her for stealing it. Whether that acquaintance acted out of spite, or greed, or some private quarrel we will never now recover, the result was the same. A garment changed hands, and a girl was sent to Botany Bay for the better part of a decade. Sarah Whitlam, a borrowed cloak, and 7 years at the bottom of the world. It is a small name and a small crime, and yet the whole of tonight's story runs, in the end, straight through them both. There was another woman aboard, older, sharper, altogether more formidable, named Elizabeth Barnsley. She had been transported for stealing cloth as well. Muslin, some 17 yards of it, lifted with a practiced hand. And here is where the tidy horror of the arithmetic begins to open out into something more human and more interesting, because Elizabeth Barnsley was no wide-eyed innocent, and she never pretended to be. She told John Nichol, with what sounds very much like pride, that her family had been swindlers and highwaymen for 100 years back, a whole dynasty of the criminal trade reaching back through generations. She had a brother in the business still, a highwayman, who came to visit her aboard the ship as well-dressed and as genteel in his manners as any gentleman you might meet in a drawing-room. This was a family that had made its living for a century at the far edge of the law. And yet, this is the thing, set even Elizabeth Barnsley's 17 yards of muslin beside the sentence of exile to the ends of the earth, and the scale still tips wrong. Whatever she was being answered by a punishment out of all proportion to the offence. And around her on that ship were dozens upon dozens of women whose crimes were far smaller than hers, and whose sentences were every bit as long. There was a woman named Anne Marsh, from Devon in the West Country, who had taken a single bushel of wheat. 1 bushel of wheat. 7 years. And there was a child. Her name was Mary Wade, and she was somewhere around 11, 12, 13 years old. The records disagree, the way records do about the poor, who were not thought worth the trouble of noting carefully. She and another girl, not much older, had set upon a still younger child and stripped her of her clothes to sell. A nasty piece of childhood desperation, the kind of thing hunger and a hard street will teach a young one to do. For that, a court had sentenced Mary Wade to hang. To hang a child of 12 by the neck until dead. The sentence was commuted in the end to transportation, and so, instead of the gallows, she was put aboard the Lady Juliana, one of the very youngest human beings England ever shipped to the other side of the planet. Remember her too, a child among grown women, going in irons to the bottom of the world. For the clothes off another child's back, this is what John Nichol saw. Then, when at last he set aside what he had been told and looked at the 200 women in his charge with his own eyes. He had come aboard expecting, in the phrase of the day, the worst women in England, hardened, dangerous, depraved, and what he found instead he set down in words as clear and as generous as anything in his whole memoir. There were not, he wrote, a great many very bad characters among them. The far greater number were, in his phrase, harmless, unfortunate creatures, the victims, he said, of the basest seduction. Girls who had been used and discarded, and then, having no way left to live, had been swept up by the law for being poor and being female in a city that had no mercy for either. To feel the full weight of the injustice, you have to understand a little of the world these women came from. The England that was, in those very years, remaking itself into something new and pitiless. The old countryside was being enclosed, the common land fenced off and taken, and the rural poor driven from the villages their families had lived in for generations. They poured into London and the manufacturing towns, into crowded rooms and cellar dwellings, into a churn of labour that could not absorb them all. A great mass of people had been shaken loose from every root that had ever held them, and set down in a city that measured a human life in shillings. In such a place, the difference between an honest woman and a convicted thief was often nothing grander than a run of bad luck, a lost position, an illness, a man's broken promise, a single hungry week. And here is the detail that turns the whole picture quietly on its head. The thing John Nichol noticed that almost no one else thought to record. A great many of these women did not regard their sentence as a punishment at all. They regarded it as a rescue. He was astonished by it. Numbers of them, he wrote, would not take their liberty as a gift if it were offered. They were thankful for their present situation. So low had life already reduced them. Some, let out of the country jails to help bring in the harvest, had simply come back on their own when the work was done and returned to their chains by choice. When he asked them why they would choose the hold of a convict ship over freedom, the answer they gave him is one of the most quietly devastating things in the entire story, and it is worth hearing close to their own words. How much better, they told him, is our situation now than it has been. Here we have good food and a warm bed. We are not beaten or left to the mercy of every drunken ruffian, as we were before. Out there, when we rose in the morning, we did not know where we would lay our heads at night, or whether we would eat at all that day. Banishment, they said, banishment to the far end of the earth, is a blessing for us. We dared not go to our own families, whom we had disgraced. Other people shut their doors in our faces. We were as though a plague were upon us, hated and shunned. Sit with that a moment. For these women, the prison ship was very possibly the safest place they had ever been. A riveted iron on the ankle and a berth in the dark of a hold, bound for a land they would never leave. And it was a step up in the world, and not every story in that hold was one of pure sorrow. Some were simply strange or stubborn, or oddly touching, the way real crowds of real people always are. There was a woman named Mary Williams, transported for receiving stolen goods, who, along with 8 others aboard, had been quietly supported during her time in Newgate by none other than Lord George Gordon, the famous half-mad nobleman whose name a great London riot still carried. Nichol himself went round each week to collect the women's allowance from him. There was a girl the whole ship called, only half in jest, Pitt's daughter, because she bore so uncanny a likeness in every feature to William Pitt, the Prime Minister of England himself, that no one could look at her without seeing it, and she never troubled to deny the whispered rumour of who her father might be. Think of that. A girl who may have carried the face of the man who ran the empire, riding in chains toward the empire's farthest dungeon, and taking a certain quiet amusement in the resemblance. These were not the worst women in England. They were all of England, in miniature. The wronged and the guilty, the clever and the broken, the highborn cast down and the lowborn simply ground under, packed together in one wooden hold and pointed at the bottom of the world. Elizabeth Barnsley understood all of this in her bones, and she did something with it. On a ship full of the desperate and the frightened, she became, in Nichol's own word, a queen. She organized the women. She looked after the ones who had nothing. She was very kind, he says, to her poorer fellow convicts. When they reached warm ports, she would buy a cask of wine and share it round. And she took up the trade that mattered most of all aboard a ship carrying so many pregnant women. She made herself the ship's midwife, the woman who would kneel in the lamplight and bring the children of this voyage safely into the world. 100 years of highwaymen and swindlers behind her. And here she was, at the bottom of the world's ledger of respectability, holding a whole floating community together with her own 2 hands. That was the cargo of the Lady Juliana. Not the worst women in England. A cross-section of the poorest and unluckiest of them, sentenced out of all proportion, some of them relieved to be going, and among them a child who had been marked for the gallows, and a woman from Lincoln who had borrowed the wrong cloak. Some of them carried griefs the law never thought to count. And one of those griefs, the very first sorrow of this voyage, arrived before the ship had even left the river. Not every woman who came aboard the Lady Juliana sailed on her. There was a girl. Nichol never gives us her name, and perhaps by the time he told the story he had lost it. Or perhaps it had simply never been his to know. A young Scottish girl brought down to the ship in the river among the rest. She was, he says, young and beautiful, even in the coarse grey convict dress they had put her in. But she was pale as death, and her eyes were red and swollen with weeping, and they stayed that way. She did not speak. She did not join the other women in their talk, or come up onto the deck into the air and the light. She kept to herself, below in the dark, folded around some private grief that she would let no one near. Nichol, being a soft-hearted Scot a long way from his own home, tried to reach her. And he found the one thing that could reach her, though it was the cruelest thing of all. It was Scotland. When he spoke to her of home, of the lowlands, of the green country and the hills they had both left behind, she would wring her hands and sob, he says, until he truly feared her heart would burst in her chest. Homesickness is too small and too gentle a word for what had hold of her. She was dying of the distance between herself and the place she belonged to, dying of it literally, before his eyes, without any other illness upon her at all. And that is exactly how she died. She never sailed. She never saw the ports, or the great slow ocean, or the strange land at the bottom of the world. Before the Lady Juliana ever weighed anchor and stood down the river for the open sea, the Scottish girl sank, in Nichol's unbearable phrase, into the grave of no disease but a broken heart. They buried her ashore at Dartford, on the Kentish bank of the Thames, a girl who had been sentenced to be carried to the ends of the earth, and who got no further than the mouth of an English river before the grief of leaving killed her. There is a particular cruelty in her death that is worth naming softly. because it is the same cruelty at the root of this entire story. The law had not sentenced her to die. Whatever small crime had put her aboard, her punishment was transportation, exile, hardship, years of labor at the far end of the world, but not death. And yet the punishment killed her anyway, quietly, before it had even properly begun, because it asked of her the one thing she did not have the strength to give, to be torn from home and to survive it. That is what the ledgers never counted. They could measure the sentence, 7 years, 14 years, life, but they could not measure what the sentence would cost a particular heart. For a hardened woman of the London streets, exile might be, as some of them said, a kind of rescue. For a gentle, homesick girl from the Scottish lowlands, the very same sentence was a death warrant, though no judge had written it as one. The system dealt in bodies and years. It had no column for the soul, and no idea that a person could simply die of missing a place. She did. And John Nichol, who understood homesickness better than most men living, who would end his own days aching for the very streets he had wandered from as a boy, never forgot the sound of her weeping when he spoke to her of Scotland. Take a moment with her, because John Nichol did, and because she is the truest measure we have of what this system actually cost. The law had a word for what it was doing to her: transportation. A clean, administrative, bloodless word. It moved a body from one place to another. It did not have a word for the thing that happened inside her, for the severing of a person from the only ground that had ever held her, and the slow failure of the heart that followed. She does not appear in the great ledgers of empire. She was not a statistic anyone thought to keep. She was simply a beautiful silent girl who could not bear to be taken away from Scotland, and so she was not taken away from it. She was laid down in the earth of England instead. And a Scottish cooper who had also left his home as a boy, and who would also, in the end, spend his old age haunting the streets of the city he had wandered from, remembered her for the rest of his life. She is the first face in the crowd to become a person. She will not be the last. For there was another scene in the river, in those long months of waiting, that Nichol carried with him just as long. And this one, mercifully, is not only sorrow, it is the most tender thing in his whole account, and it deserves to be told slowly, exactly as it happened. One day, a respectable-looking country couple came aboard the ship. You could see at a glance that they were decent people, not of the criminal world at all, not of London's underside, but plain, honest folk up from the country, out of their depth and sick with worry. They had come searching for their daughter. She had vanished into the great pit of London some time before, as the daughters of country families sometimes did, and they had followed the faint thread of her at last all the way to Newgate prison. And from Newgate they had been sent on, down to the river, to this ship. The jailer had pointed them toward the steward. toward Nicole as the man who would know whether such a girl was aboard. The mother could barely get the words out. With tears standing in her eyes, she implored him, that is his word, implored, to tell her whether a girl of that name was on the ship. And Nicole, checking, found that there was. There was one of that name aboard. Her name was Sarah Dorset. What he does next tells you everything about the man. He did not simply point them below and turn back to his work. He called a coach. He drove with them to the waterside. He brought them out to the ship and helped them aboard, the father coming up the side of the vessel with a trembling step, an ordinary man climbing into a world of chains and convicts to find his lost child. The mother, so overcome that she had to be half lifted aboard, her legs no longer quite her own. Nicole took them to his own berth, his own small private corner of the ship, and settled them there, and then he went to fetch the girl. And here I am, going to slow almost to a stop, because this is the heart of the chapter, and Nicole himself never rushed it. He brought Sarah to them, and her father, this plain, decent, trembling man who had crossed half of England to find her, looked at his daughter, at what the world had done to her and what she had done to herself, and he could not hold it. In a choking voice, he said just 3 words, "My lost child." And then he turned his back on her. He turned away and covered his face with his hands because he could not bear to be seen, or perhaps could not bear to look, a father undone, hiding his own face in the dark of a convict ship. The mother did not turn away. The mother, sobbing, threw her arms around her daughter and held on, and Sarah, poor Sarah, at the center of it, fainted dead away and fell at their feet. Nicole stood there, and by his own admission, did not know what to do. There is nothing a man can do in a moment like that but witness it. At length she came back to herself, and when she did, in accents he calls heart-rending, she begged them, her own mother and father, to forgive her. That is where I want to leave the scene itself, on that impossible plea, because it is where its power lives. But you should know a little of how she had come to that ship, told the way Nicole tells it, as consequence and sorrow, never as spectacle. She had been young and pretty, and she had not been 2 years gone from her father's house. A man had made her promises and ruined her, and then abandoned her within a matter of weeks, as such men did and do. And once she was ruined, once she was a girl with no character left and no way home, the city closed around her exactly as it closed around all the others. Want drove her into the street. The law took her up as a disorderly girl. And the same machine that we have been watching all along, the one that measures a woman's whole life against the price of a cloak, swept her up and set her down here, in the hold of a ship bound for the ends of the earth, where her mother and father finally found her, too late to change any of it, and just in time to say goodbye. What became of Sarah Dorset afterward is less certain than the old sailor's account might make it seem, and we will not pretend to more than we know. There are threads in the record. A son born to her not long after they reached the colony. A life that went on in ways both hard and ordinary on the far shore. But the truth of her chapter is not in any of that. The truth of her chapter is a father who crossed a country to find his daughter and could not look at her face, and a girl who woke from a faint to beg the two people who loved her most for a pardon she did not owe. Some reunions do not heal anything. They only let you say the thing aloud before the distance takes over for good. Two griefs, then, before the ship has even reached the sea. A girl who died of missing home. A girl who was found only to be lost again. This is the low place of our story. Sit here in it a while, the way you sometimes have to sit in the low places of your own life before you can move on from them. And then, improbably, out of all this sorrow, the Lady Juliana stood down the river and turned her bow toward the open ocean, and something happened aboard her that the world would never quite forgive. And that, seen honestly, was not a scandal at all, but a kind of life. Here is the sentence that would follow this ship down through 200 years of history. It is John Nichols' own. And it is worth setting down exactly as he wrote it, because almost everything that was ever said about the Lady Juliana grows out of these few plain words. When we were fairly out to sea, he wrote, every man on board took a wife from among the convicts, they nothing loath. That is the whole of it. That is the seed of the legend. And I want us to sit with that sentence honestly and unhurriedly tonight, because how you hear it decides whether you understand this ship at all. You could hear it, as a great many people afterward chose to hear it, as scandal, as proof of a floating den of vice, a shipload of loose women and the men who used them. Exactly the sort of thing the respectable imagination loves to be appalled by. Or you could hear it the way the man who wrote it seems to have meant it, as a plain account of what happens when you confine some 30 or so sailors and more than 200 women together in a small wooden world for the better part of a year at the edge of the known earth. What happened is that they paired off. They formed households. Nicholl does not describe encounters. He describes wives and husbands. He speaks of the women the men lived with, cared for, and in more than one case genuinely loved. The word he reaches for again and again is not sin. It is marriage, or the nearest thing to marriage that a ship with no clergyman aboard could make. Let me be careful and clear here, because this is a story for the whole family of the night, and because the truth does not require us to linger anywhere unseemly. We are not going to go below and pull back any curtains. We do not need to. Everything that matters about what happened on the Lady Juliana can be seen in its consequences, out in the daylight, fully clothed, and the consequences are where the human truth actually lives. So let us look at the consequences. The first is children. Over the long months of the voyage, a great many of the women became pregnant, and babies began to be born at sea, brought into the world in the lamplit dark of the hold by Elizabeth Barnsley our shoplifter queen turned midwife, kneeling on the boards with her practiced hands. The ship had been provisioned thoughtfully with suits of child-bed linen, little sets of infant clothes and swaddling, donated by charitable ladies back in England who understood exactly what such a voyage would produce, and chose to answer it with kindness rather than condemnation. Nicholl, as steward, would hand these out, port by port, as the children came. There was even a story that ran in the English newspapers afterward. You may take it as fact or as the flourish of a gleeful press, and honestly no one now can be quite sure that the women were delivered soon after they arrived, of some 37 children, the exact number, the papers crowed, of the men who had sailed the ship. It is too neat a number to trust. But the thing underneath the number is real enough. This was a voyage that made families as it went. The second consequence is money. And here the women's own hard cleverness comes into full view. In the ports, where the ship lay for weeks at a time, the women were allowed considerable freedom, and they used it to earn. Some of them made and sold shirts. The captain himself set 20 and more of them sewing garments from his own store of linen, to be sold at a fat profit in the goods-starved colony at the far end. Some earned money in other ways, from the sailors and the visitors who rowed out to the famous ship of women in every harbour. And it was Barnsley, by the later accounts, who organised much of it, who made sure that the women were properly paid and looked after, and not simply used and cast aside. Think of what that actually means. On a ship that history would remember as a floating brothel, the closest thing to a governing authority among the women themselves was a matron determined that none of them be cheated. That is not the story the label tells, but it is the story the evidence tells. And there is a third consequence, gentler and stranger, and it belongs to the women's genius for survival. Among them was a cluster of Jewish women who hit upon a scheme so cheerful and so harmless that it makes you smile even now. At the Catholic ports, Tenerife and the others to come, they borrowed a crucifix and they passed themselves off as good Roman Catholics. And by this simple performance, they drew gifts and small kindnesses from the devout people ashore. And it worked. It worked at every port they tried it. There is nothing in that of vice. There is only wit and nerve, and the deep resourcefulness of people who have learned that the only tools they will ever be handed are their own quick minds. It is of a piece with a woman named Nellie Kerwin, aboard for forging seamen's papers, who once talked the ship's own agent into sending a man ashore to fetch what he thought was an urgent express, and it turned out to be nothing but her own money, which she wanted collected. And she laughed in his face, Nicholl says, and told him he was now in her debt for the lesson. These are not the deeds of the worst women in England. They are the deeds of the cornered and the clever, using the only leverage they had. Now, the label itself, the floating brothel. I have used the phrase because you came here having heard it, and because it is the name the world hung on this ship. But you deserve to know where that name actually comes from, and the answer will surprise you. No one aboard the Lady Juliana ever called her that. It is not a phrase from 1789. It was not shouted from the docks or written in the ship's papers. It was fixed to her long afterward, coined by a maritime historian in the middle of the 20th century, more than 150 years after the last woman aboard had lived and died, and then set in stone in our own time as the title of a popular book. The women who lived this voyage never heard those two words. The name is a verdict, and it was passed on them by people who never met them, who were not born until every soul aboard was long in the ground. It is the judgment of strangers, reaching back across 2 centuries to tell these women what they were. Set that judgment down for a moment beside the actual ship, the midwife, the child-bed linen, the shirt-making, the matron making sure the poor were paid. And simply notice how poorly the one describes the other. That is all I will ask of you here. Not to swallow the label, and not yet to overturn it. Only to hold it in one hand and the living ship in the other, and feel the weight of each. Because ashore, in respectable England, none of these fine distinctions were made. Ashore, the story wrote itself in the ugliest colours available. A ship of only women, poor women, disorderly women, street women, sailing off to a colony that had openly asked to be sent women. To the moral imagination of the age, it was a scandal that named itself before the anchor was even up. The gap between what the respectable classes pictured and what actually happened on the water is one of the widest gaps in this whole story. On shore, they imagined an orgy afloat. On the water, there were couples keeping each other company, and a woman handing out baby clothes, and children being born, and an agent who had quietly decided that his one real job was to land these people alive. And notice, please, who got the name and who did not. The Empire shipped tens of thousands of convict men across the seas, on ship after ship, and paired-off arrangements and worse were common enough on plenty of those decks, and yet no one ever branded a men's transport a floating anything. The men were criminals. The women were a scandal. The very same government that had, in its own offices, coldly decided to ship women out precisely to be the mothers of a colony. That had made the whole thing a matter of demographic policy, then stood back and let those same women wear the shame of it, as though they had invented their own situation. The women were sent to do a thing the Empire wanted done, and then judged forever for having been sent to do it. That double standard is the real engine of the floating brothel legend. It says a great deal about the people who coined the phrase, and almost nothing true about the women it was hung upon. So hold the two hands a little longer. The world's ugly word in the one, and in the other the actual ship with its midwife and its child-bed linen and its matron counting out fair shares. Do not swallow the label. Do not yet overturn it. Only feel how unequally the two of them weigh in the hand, and carry that unevenness with you, quietly, as we sail on. We have been circling back this whole while toward the moment we began with: the forge, the anvil, the struck iron, the pale face in the lantern light. Now we have arrived at it again, and this time we are going to stay. Her name, we can finally say plainly, was Sarah Whitlam, the girl from Lincoln, the one sent to the ends of the earth for a borrowed cloak. She was one of the women whose ankle iron John Nickel had knocked loose on his anvil for his half-crown fee, one face among the 200. And from that moment, by his own telling, he was undone. He had fixed his fancy upon her, he said, from the instant he struck the rivet from her irons, as firmly as he had ever resolved anything in his life. It is worth pausing over how strange that is, and how completely he owns it. He does not dress it up. He does not claim they spoke first, or that he came to know her mind, or that anything happened at all in the ordinary way that people fall for one another. He tells us plainly that the feeling arrived whole, in an instant, over an act as unromantic as knocking a rivet out of an iron, the same task he had done for 100 other women without a flicker. Ah, why her? Why that face, that day, out of all of them? He never explains it, because he cannot. There is no explaining it. That is simply how the deepest attachments of a life so often come, not reasoned into, but recognized, the way you recognize a place you have never been, and somehow know. A hammer came down, an iron fell away. A tired stranger looked up into the lantern light, and a wandering man who had circled the whole earth without ever once wanting to stop, stopped. He had found, without looking, and in the least likely corner of the world, the thing he had spent 34 years not knowing he was missing. Over the long months that the ship lay in the river, and then over the slow, warm weeks once she stood out to sea, that first lightning recognition had time to become something quieter and far stronger. As steward, he moved among the women daily, and he could seek her out and speak with her and learn who she actually was behind the pale face that had caught him. The instant became an acquaintance. The acquaintance became a life. By the time they were well out on the ocean, they were, in every way that the two of them could manage, together. What was she like? He tells us, and it is a small, careful, loving portrait, the kind a man gives of someone he has turned over in his memory 10,000 times. She was, he said, a girl of a modest, reserved turn, as kind and as true a creature as ever lived. Not one of the wild ones. Not one of the loud, quick, bright-burning women who ruled the deck. A quiet girl, a little withdrawn, gentle. You can feel, in the plainness of his words, how completely she had caught him, not with fire, but with something steadier that a wandering man had perhaps never let himself want before. Because that is the thing about John Nickel you must hold in mind to understand what happened to him aboard this ship. He was the wanderer. He was the boy who had read Robinson Crusoe until he ached to be gone, the man who had already sailed round the entire world once and could not be kept on land, the sailor who had come home half meaning to settle and had bolted again the instant a letter offered him one more voyage. One? Nothing had ever held John Nichol. Not his father's trade, not his own good sense, not the green fields of Curry. He had spent 34 years slipping every anchor that was ever thrown to him. And now, in the cramped world of a convict ship, over a quiet girl from the Lincolnshire fens, the wanderer, for the first and only time in his life, wanted to stay. He courted her, he says, for a week and upwards, a strange, tender phrase, that, and upwards, as if he could not quite bring himself to put a number on it, as if the days had run together into one long, warm astonishment. And he tells us, in a single sentence that carries the whole weight of what she had become to him, that he would have married her on the spot, married her then and there, in the middle of the ocean, had there been a clergyman on board. But there was no clergyman on board. Let that fact simply sit where it falls, quietly, without any weight laid on it yet. A convict transport does not carry a chaplain. There was no one aboard the Lady Juliana with the authority to say the words over them and make it binding in the eyes of the law and the church. So they did the only thing two people in their situation could do. They pledged themselves to each other privately, by their own word, with no book and no witness but the sea. In his heart and in hers, they were married. On no paper, anywhere in the world, were they anything at all. For now, though, and this is what I want you to feel in this chapter, and only this, for now, that did not matter in the least. For now, they were simply, wholly, presently happy. Picture it as gently as you can. A small ship on a wide ocean, rolling slowly southward through warm latitudes. A quiet corner below, a shared berth, a single Bible that had been the companion of all his voyages, its pages soft with handling. Two people who had each, in their different ways, been discarded by the world, a convict woman bound for exile, a rootless sailor who belonged to no place and no one, and who had found, in the least likely spot on all the earth, someone to belong to. The days, he would say later, flew on eagle's wings. When you are that happy, they always do. Think of the shape of their days. In the mornings, the great kettle went on, and the tea was passed round, hot and sweet, and the ship woke to her routine, the watches changing, the women at their washing and their sewing, the endless small work of a vessel at sea. Nichol went about his stewarding, counting the stores, serving the provisions, and wherever his rounds took him, he could find her and trade a word and know she was there. In the evenings, the same kettle, the same tea, the same slow settling of 200 lives towards sleep as the light went out of the sky and the sea turned to black glass under the stars. And through all of it, the two of them at the center of their own small quiet, not hiding anything, for the whole ship had paired off, and no one thought a thing of it, but simply belonging to each other in plain sight, the way married people do. He had crossed the whole world alone. Now he crossed a stretch of it beside someone, and every ordinary hour of it was, to him, extraordinary. That is what love does to plain days. It does not fill them with events. It fills them with meaning, so that a cup of tea and a shared berth and the sound of the sea against the hull become the richest hours a man has ever lived. He knew, even then, that he was happy. That is rarer than you might think. Most of us only recognize our happy seasons long after they are gone. John Nichol knew it while he was inside it, which is perhaps why the loss of it, when it came, cut him for the rest of his life. And around this one small, still point of happiness, the whole strange, teeming life of the ship went on. The berths and the bargains, the ports and the hustles, the wooden discipline and the wide blue miles. A child was already coming to John Nichol and Sarah Whitlam, though it had not yet arrived, and Sarah had a friend among the women, a gentle, wronged girl named Mary Rose, who would see her through it when the time came. All of that was still ahead. For this one chapter, let them simply be a young man and a young woman in love on a slow ship in a warm sea, with no clergyman and no need of one, and the whole voyage still before them. We will let them have that. They earned it. And so, I think, tonight, have you. Now, let us go up out of that quiet berth and into the daylight of the ship itself, into the ordinary, remarkable rhythm of 200 lives being lived, all at once, between the waves. A ship at sea is a small town that never stops moving. For the better part of a year, the Lady Juliana carried a whole society inside her wooden walls, more than 250 souls, when you counted the women and the children and the crew, and that society had to be fed and washed and doctored and disciplined and kept from flying apart day after day after day across thousands of miles of empty water. Tonight, I want to simply live inside that rhythm with you for a while, because the daily texture of this voyage is one of its quietest surprises. We have been told to imagine a den of vice. What the record actually shows is something much closer to a floating parish, busy, ordinary, and, for its age, astonishingly humane. Start with the food, because at sea, everything starts with the food. As steward, John Nichol was the man who kept the stores and served out the provisions, and while the ship lay in the river, he went ashore every single day to buy fresh meat and vegetables, so that the women ate well before they ever tasted salt rations. Once they were out on the open ocean, the ship did something small and kind that tells you a great deal about how she was run. Instead of the endless grim government ration of salt beef and salt pork, they substituted tea and sugar for part of it. Every night and every morning, a great kettle of hot water was boiled for all the convicts and all the crew alike, so that the women could have their tea, hot and sweet, at the beginning and the end of each long day at sea. It is such a small thing. A hot drink twice a day in the dark and the wet. And it is exactly the kind of small thing that keeps human beings alive and human across a 10-month voyage. They kept clean too, to a degree that would have astonished the men on the death ships that came later. In port, the women were given as much water as they liked for washing their clothes, and they used it gladly. Nichol says that many days they would go through 4 and 5 boatloads of fresh water in a single day, scrubbing and rinsing and hanging their washing to dry in the rigging until the ship must have looked, from a distance, like a strange, blossoming thing. Once at sea, They wore their own clothes, the clothes that the kind agent, Thomas Edgar, had refused to let anyone throw overboard, telling Nickel to stow them away because the poor creatures would have need of them when they reached the far shore. That decision, to let 200 women keep their own dresses instead of pitching them into the sea, is worth pausing over because it tells you almost everything about how this ship was run, and it did not have to be that way. There had been another agent first, before Edgar. And that first man had begun his tenure while the ship still lay in the English River by flogging the women, reaching for the lash before they had even put to sea. He was dismissed for it. Someone in authority looked at a man who answered a hold full of frightened women with a whip and decided he was the wrong man and put Thomas Edgar in his place instead. Edgar, who had sailed with the great Captain Cook and who turned out to be, in Nickel's simple and heartfelt phrase, a kind, humane man and very good to them. Two men offered the same power over the same helpless people. One reached for the lash, and one reached for a woman's own folded dress and told the steward to keep it safe for her. On the Lady Juliana, kindness was not an accident. It was a series of choices made by particular men who could just as easily have chosen otherwise, and on other ships, run by other men, did. They moved freely about the vessel. And they worked. The captain, George Aitken, set 20 and more of them to sewing shirts out of his own bolts of linen. Good shirts that he meant to sell for a handsome profit in the good starved colony ahead, so that even the women's labor was folded into the strange economy of the voyage, and their hands were kept busy, and some small coin found its way to them. And through all of this, life kept doing the one thing life insists on doing, even in a prison at sea. It kept arriving. The babies came all through the voyage. In the lamplit dark of the hold, on the rolling boards, Elizabeth Barnsley, the shoplifter queen, the woman from 100 years of highwaymen, knelt as the ship's midwife and caught the children of the Lady Juliana as they were born, one after another, across the long months and the warm latitudes. Nichols served out the little suits of childbed linen as each one came. And somewhere in the middle of that voyage, in the middle of all those births, Sarah Whitlam bore John Nichol a son. We know almost nothing of that child, not his name for certain, not his face, not the hour of his coming. We know only that he was born on the water, halfway between the world Sarah had been exiled from and the world she was being carried toward, and that a gentle young woman named Mary Rose nursed Sarah through her confinement and helped bring the boys safely into the light. Mary Rose deserves her own moment here, because her story is one more turn of the same terrible wheel. She was a farmer's daughter of good family, seduced under a promise of marriage by an officer, and then, when she lodged with a landlady who wanted to keep her board money, deliberately framed for a theft she had never committed and convicted on a lie. She was innocent, genuinely, provably innocent, and after the ship had sailed, her people would prove it, and the lying landlady would stand in the pillory for her perjury, and a pardon and a chest of fine clothes would be waiting for Mary Rose at journey's end. But all of that was still to come. For now, she was simply a wronged girl on a convict ship, keeping to herself, taking up with no man, and kneeling beside her friend Sarah in the dark to help a sailor's son be born. The innocent nursing the beloved. That is the ship history called a brothel. Not everything aboard was tender, of course. A town of 200 needs its discipline, and here the Lady Juliana gives us the single most delightful scene in all of John Nichols' memoir. A scene that shows you shipboard justice with not a drop of blood in it, and a woman whose spirit simply could not be broken. Her name was Nance Farrell, and she was, in Nichols' fond and exasperated words, ever making disturbance. She was one of those souls who seem put on the earth to test authority, and she was very good at it. For a while she and some others grew deliberately, spectacularly unruly, acting out on purpose, it seemed, so as to be confined below in punishment. Nichol, being steward and being no fool, eventually worked out why. Overhauling the stores one day, he discovered a great cask of bottled porter with a neat hole cut in its side, and inside it, in place of the full bottles, nothing but empties, and a box of candles gone besides. The truth came clear. Being confined in the hold was giving the women access to the drink. The punishment was a reward. They were misbehaving in order to be sent down to where the porter was. The fix belonged to the clever agent Edgar, and it was a masterpiece of mercy and mischief both. He took an empty flour barrel, and he cut a hole in the top of it for the head, and a hole in each side for the arms, and he fitted it over the offender like a great wooden collar. They called it the wooden jacket. Locked into it, a woman could stand, and she could shuffle a few steps, but she could not sit, and she could not lie down, and she could not reach the drink or anything else. It was uncomfortable and faintly ridiculous and entirely bloodless, and they clapped it onto Nance Farrell. And Nance Farrell defied it magnificently. A friend lit her a pipe of tobacco and set it in her mouth, since her arms were pinned. And Nance, corked into a flour barrel, unable to sit or lie, meant to be humbled before the whole ship, began instead to perform. She strutted. She smoked her pipe. She made the other women laugh at the droll figure she cut. And then, gloriously, she danced a minuet, there in her wooden barrel, her head swaying from side to side, Nichol says, like a turtle's, the very picture of unbroken defiance turned into comedy. She kept it up until sheer exhaustion finally wore her down, and only then, worn out rather than cowed, did she beg pardon in humble terms before the evening was out. And then, of course, within a few days, she was back at it again. There was no taming her by gentle means, Nichol admitted. In the end, only the lash ever curbed her at all, and even that, only for a while. But you can hear, under his words, how much he admired her. In a story so full of women crushed by forces larger than themselves, Nance Farrell is the one who could not be crushed, who took the instrument of her punishment and danced a minuet in it. Let her stand for all of them. There were lighter marvels too. When the ship crossed the equator, the line, sailors called it, the crew staged the old ceremony, skinning a porpoise they had caught to costume one of their number as Neptune, king of the sea, rising up dripping over the rail, and one poor convict woman, seeing this apparition of a merman heave itself aboard, fainted clean away. It was theatre. It was the crew's rough good humor, a bit of spectacle to break the monotony of the endless water, and it belongs in the picture just as much as the sorrows do, because these 10 months were not only grief and injustice. They were also hot tea in the dark, and clean washing in the rigging, and a newborn's first cry, and a woman dancing in a barrel, and a sailor dressed as a sea god, making the whole ship shriek and laugh. They were prisoners. The days were bounded, and the irons were real, and no one aboard could forget for long where they were being taken or why. And yet within those bounds, across those long rocking months, these people built something that looked more and more like an ordinary human community, like a home that happened to be made of oak and canvas, and to be moving, always moving, across the face of the sea. A home that kept dropping its anchor every few weeks in the great harbors of the world. The title that drew you to this story tonight promised a ship of women that stopped in many of the great cities of the world, and now we have come to the part of the voyage that makes good on it. Because the Lady Juliana did not race to the bottom of the earth. She ambled there. She took the better part of a year, stopping at one famous harbor after another, lingering for weeks at a time, and though no one planned it quite this way, that unhurried, port-hopping journey was the single greatest reason the women aboard her lived. At every stop there was fresh meat, and fresh fruit, and clean water, and green vegetables, and rest. Slowness, on this voyage, was mercy, quietly, invisibly, without a soul aboard ever quite knowing to be grateful for it. Hold that small thought gently as we go from harbor to harbor. Their first landfall was Santa Cruz to Tenerife, in the Canary Islands, off the coast of Africa, reached in the warm days of late September, some weeks out from England. Picture the shock of it, after the grey Channel and the open Atlantic, a steep volcanic island, rising out of a blue sea, white houses stacked up a hillside, the air suddenly soft and full of the smell of land. They put in for water. And, almost at once, the ship of women became the sensation of the harbor. The local people came aboard freely through the day. Visiting captains and their officers rowed over to pay their calls and see for themselves this vessel, the like of which no one had encountered. Elizabeth Barnsley bought her cask of wine here, to share among the women, as she liked to do. The Jewish women worked their cheerful crucifix trick on the devout Catholics of the island and came away with gifts. And here, the records leave it a little uncertain, and I will not pretend otherwise. It seems that 4 of the women slipped ashore and escaped, vanishing into the streets of Santa Cruz, though Nicol himself remembered such an escape happening back in England before ever they sailed. Either way, at this first port, the world's response to the Lady Juliana was simple, uncomplicated curiosity. A ship of women. How strange. Come and look. And here, it is worth stopping to feel what these harbors must have meant to the women themselves, because we are so used to thinking of them as prisoners that we forget what was actually happening to them. Most of them had spent the last stretch of their lives in the worst places England had, the reeking hold of a hulk, a stone cell, the gutters of a hard city. Many had never in their lives been more than a few miles from where they were born. And now, one after another, the wonders of the wide world were being unrolled in front of them. A volcanic island rising blue out of the sea. The smell of orange groves and strange spice coming off the land on the warm wind. Foreign voices, foreign coins, foreign fruit they had no names for. Whatever else the Lady Juliana was, she was, for the women aboard her, very possibly the only journey of their lives, the one time the poorest women in England were carried, slowly and in reasonable comfort, past some of the most beautiful places on the earth. There is a strange grace in that, buried inside the injustice, that the same sentence which tore them from everything they knew also showed them a world they would otherwise have died without ever glimpsing. They looked at Tenerife, and, for once, the world looked back at them, not as criminals, but simply as a wonder that had sailed into the bay. At their next stop, that curiosity took on a darker shading, and it came, tellingly, through John Nichols' own eyes. They put in at the Cape Verde Islands, at Santiago, for water again, and there Nicholl noticed something that clearly troubled him even decades later when he set it down. 2 ships had followed them there, followed the Lady Juliana the whole way from Tenerife, out of their own proper course, and Nicholl understood exactly why. They had come, in the sailor's phrase, for the sake of the ladies. They lingered near, and their men came visiting day after day whenever the weather allowed. And then, when the Lady Juliana sailed on, those 2 ships turned away toward the African coast, because they were slave ships, and they had a course of their own to keep, and a cargo of their own to take on. Nicholl calls it, in his plain and terrible way, their cargo of human misery. Hold that image, because it is one of the sober turning points of the whole voyage. A ship of banished Englishwomen, and beside her for a few days, 2 ships bound to chain up human beings and sell them, the trade the age ran on, passing close enough to wave. It is here, watching those slavers peel away toward their awful work, that you feel the reputation of his own ship beginning to gather around Nicholl like weather. The world was starting to look at the Lady Juliana in a certain way, to talk about her in a certain way, to follow her for a certain reason. He was beginning to see it happen. Then came the long stop, the great one, the one that any traveler of that age would have dreamed of, Rio de Janeiro, on the coast of Brazil. They lay there for the better part of 2 months, taking on coffee and sugar, and for John Nicholl, it was almost like ordinary life. He went ashore daily with his cooper's tools and mended the ship's flour casks on the wharves, an honest craftsman at his trade in one of the most beautiful harbors on earth, the great green mountains standing over the bay. Here, the pace of the voyage's hidden work becomes visible in a single, homely detail. It was at Rio that Nicholl began serving out the suits of childbed linen in earnest, handing over some 20 of the 50 little sets the charitable ladies of England had sent, hard, tender evidence of just how many children this voyage was bringing into the world. The women, given their long liberty in port, set up a kind of tent for themselves ashore, and had, as Nicholl dryly puts it, a constant run of visitors. And through it all, Barnsley went on being the midwife, and the babies went on coming. And a girl from Lincoln named Sarah walked the wharves of Rio de Janeiro on the arm of a Scottish cooper who had never, in all his wandering, had anyone to show the world to before. Whatever else this strange voyage was taking from these people, it was also, for a season, giving them the world, its harbours, its colour, its warm foreign nights. And then, at the last of the great ports, the whole mood of the voyage changed. They came to the Cape of Good Hope, the great turning corner at the bottom of Africa, and lay there about a month, provisioning for the last long haul across the Southern Ocean. They took aboard livestock for the starving colony, 73 ewes and a ram, a whole small flock, and one of the convict women was made shepherdess over them, and tended them so faithfully across the rest of the voyage that not a single one was lost. There was a moment of real terror at the Cape, too. The ship nearly burned. The carpenter let a pot of pitch boil over, and the flames leapt up alarmingly, and the shrieks of the women, and the confusion of everyone running about, very nearly turned a small accident into a catastrophe, until Nicholl snatched a pair of blankets from his berth, and smothered the fire down until others could drown it with water, for which the grateful captain made him a handsome gift. But it was not the fire that changed everything. It was the news. At the Cape, the people of the Lady Juliana learned that another ship, a vessel called the Guardian, a store ship, sent out ahead of them, loaded with supplies meant to feed the colony they were sailing toward, had struck an island of ice in the Southern Ocean and been so badly wrecked that most of her crew had abandoned her and were never heard of again. The Guardian had been the colony's lifeline. She had been carrying the food and the tools and the seed that Sydney Cove was desperately waiting for. And she was gone, spilled across the ice at the bottom of the world. You could feel the temperature of the whole voyage drop in that moment. Up to now, the ports had been wonder and novelty and warm foreign harbours. Now, suddenly, there was dread out ahead of them in the dark. The people aboard understood at once what it meant, that the colony they were bound for must be in terrible want, and that they were sailing a shipload of women straight into a place that could not feed them. They did what they could. They packed on extra flour and extra necessaries at the Cape, as much as they could carry, for a settlement they now knew was starving. And then they weighed anchor for the last time, and turned the ship's bow toward the empty Southern Ocean, and sailed away from the last lit harbor of the known world, toward the one that had been forgotten. The great cities were behind them now. Ahead lay only the cold water and the long weeks, and the silent coast of New South Wales, and whatever was left alive when they got there. They made the land on the 3rd of June, 1790. John Nicholl remembered the date exactly, and he remembered the strange arithmetic of it, that it was, as he put it, just 1 year, all but 1 day, from the time they had left the river in England. Very nearly a year to the day. Something over 300 days at sea and in harbour, a slow rocking passage most of the way around the globe, and now, at last, the low, unfamiliar coast of New South Wales, rising out of the southern winter, for it was winter here, everything turned upside down, June cold instead of June warm, at the bottom of the world. There was weather off the coast, and it took them a few more days to work the ship up into the great harbour and come to anchor in Sydney Cove, and a few days more before the women were all set ashore. But the 3rd of June was the day they raised the land, and it is the date Nickel kept, and so it is ours. And here is the thing he says next, so simply that it is easy to rush past, though it is the quiet triumph of the whole voyage. We landed all our convicts safe. Safe. More than 200 women and the children born to them on the way carried the better part of a year around the world and landed safe. Of all the souls who had sailed, only a mere handful had died on that entire enormous journey. For an age of sail voyage of 10 months, packed with the poorest and least cared for people in the empire, it was very nearly a miracle. Hold on to that plain word, whatever else the night brings. Safe. They arrived alive. And then look at what they arrived into. The colony at Sydney Cove was starving. Not going hungry, starving. Since the First Fleet had planted the settlement more than 2 years before, not a single supply ship had reached them from England. 2 years and more, at the end of the longest supply line on Earth, and nothing had come. The stored provisions had dwindled and dwindled, and the governor had cut the rations and then cut them again, until the whole colony, convict and soldier and officer alike, was living on a starvation allowance and slowly weakening. They had planted crops in strange soil and watched many of them fail. They had begun to believe, out there in their isolation, that the mother country had simply forgotten them, that they had been dropped at the end of the world and left to die. And into that gaunt, frightened, half-abandoned place there now sailed a ship. The first ship from home in over 2 years. To be one of those first colonists in the winter of 1790 was to live inside a particular kind of despair that is hard for us now to imagine. They were perhaps 1,000 people dropped on the shore of a continent whose interior no European had walked, whose seasons ran backward, whose plants and animals answered to no book they owned. They had come to farm, and the farming had gone badly. They had come expecting resupply, and the resupply had not come, not for 1 year, not for 2. Every morning, a lookout watched the mouth of the harbor for a sail, and every evening, the sea was empty again. Slowly, it had dawned on them that they might simply have been forgotten, that a government 11,000 miles away had posted them to the ends of the earth and then, distracted by its own affairs, lost track of them entirely, and that they would weaken and starve and die here, one by one, with no one at home ever quite noticing. That is the frame of mind the colony had sunk into. And into it, one June morning, came a sail. Imagine standing on that shore and seeing her masts come up over the water. Imagine what hope must have leapt up in every starving heart at the sight, supplies, at last, rescue, at last, word from home, at last. And then, imagine the news actually landing. because the Lady Juliana brought news, and it was a bitter mixture. She brought word from England, including the strange domestic bulletin that the King, George III, had gone mad and then recovered his wits. But she also brought the confirmation of the thing they had learned at the Cape, that the Guardian, the great store ship that had been sent out ahead specifically to provision this colony, was wrecked on the ice and would never arrive. The supplies these people had been praying for were at the bottom of the Southern Ocean. And the ship that had come instead, the first ship in 2 years, was not a store ship at all. She was carrying 200 and more women, 200 more mouths to feed, set down into a settlement that could not feed the mouths it already had. Sit with how cruel that turn is. The relief of the sail on the horizon, curdling within a day into a deeper fear. The rescue that was not a rescue. A starving colony and a ship of the hungry arriving to join it. This is the collision the whole long voyage had been sailing toward. All those warm harbors and slow blue miles bending, without anyone quite seeing it, toward this bare and frightening shore. Nickel, being Nickel, gives us the small human details that make it bearable, and even, here and there, sweet. There is a mercy in the way his account works. Even at the bleakest turns, he keeps noticing the small living things, the herb, the child, the ordinary kindness, the way a person keeps noticing them in real life, which is how we all get through the hard passages of our own. His work was not done at the landing. By the terms of his agreement, the captain was bound to keep feeding the women for 6 weeks after they arrived. So Nickel went on as steward a while longer, and he tells us that a sergeant of the Marines kept the ship supplied with potatoes and garden stuff for £0.50 a day, and that with 36 of them still aboard, they had as much as they could use. Small domestic arithmetic in the middle of a famine, a reminder that even at the edge of catastrophe, life is still mostly made of ordinary days that have to be fed and gotten through. He noticed that there were only 2 native people in the little town at that time, a boy and a girl, children who had been left behind and taken in by the settlers, a glimpse, in passing, of the far larger and sadder story of whose land this actually was, a story the age barely paused to see. And he fell in love with a plant. There was a native herb the colonists steeped like tea, and Nickel was charmed by it. It needs no sugar, he marveled, and is both a bitter and a sweet at once. He liked it very much. He carried 2 whole bags of the sweet tea away with him when he left, and later, when 2 of his shipmates fell sick with scurvy, he gave it to them, and it soon cured them. And when at last he reached China, his friends there bought it from him eagerly. Such a small, warm human thing to carry away from the edge of the world, a fondness for a strange, sweet herb. There was one sight in that starving colony, though, that he never forgot, and it hangs over the whole arrival like something out of a dream. Among the settlers was an aged woman, grey-haired, a former convict, and she was suckling a child, a baby she herself had born there in the colony, late in her life, against all expectation. People came from all around simply to look at her, this old woman with an infant at her breast, in a place that could barely keep anyone alive, and, half joking and half wondering, They credited her strange late fruitfulness to the sweet tea. It is an image of life insisting on itself in the most barren of grounds, an old woman nursing a new baby at the hungry bottom of the world, and it is exactly the note the arrival ends on. Not despair. Something stubborner than despair. For the women of the lady, Juliana had, without meaning to, changed this place, simply by arriving in it. Before them, the colony had been a settlement of men, 4 and 5 to every woman. Now, in a single stroke, the number of women had very nearly doubled. The demographic seed the far-off planners had wanted sown was, at that moment, sown. Whatever Sydney Cove was going to become, it would grow, in no small part, from the women who had just walked down onto its shore for a scrap of cloth and a bushel of wheat. And so they came ashore, into the hunger and the winter light, and began the work of making lives at the end of the world, knowing only that they had come through alive into a place with little to feed them, and that whatever waited here would have to be met the way everything on this long voyage had been met, one slow day at a time. A few weeks after the Lady Juliana landed her women safe, more ships came into Sydney Cove. They were the vessels of what came to be called the Second Fleet, 3 convict transports, the Neptune, the Scarborough, and the Surprise, carrying, this time, men. They had left England after the Lady Juliana and taken a faster, more direct road, driven hard across the sea by contractors who were paid by the head to carry convicts and who had discovered a profitable, monstrous truth, that they were paid whether the convicts arrived alive or dead. On the Neptune especially, the men were kept chained below in their own filth, denied the open deck, and deliberately starved, their rations held back and sold, their bodies left to waste, because a dead convict cost the contractor nothing, and a live one had to be fed. When those ships opened their hatches in Sydney Cove, what came up, and what did not come up, is among the darkest things in the whole history of that coast. Of the roughly 1,000 men who had been put aboard the 3 transports, something on the order of a quarter had died at sea, hundreds of them gone into the water on the way. And, of those who had survived to reach the harbour, huge numbers were so wasted by hunger and sickness that they could not stand. They had to be lifted out of the holds like cargo and carried ashore, and many of them died in the following days and weeks on the beach, in the hospital tents, in the sight of the starving colony that had no way to save them. Men reduced to skeletons. Men who had been alive when the anchors dropped and were dead by the end of the week. I will not linger over the details, because they do not need lingering over. The fact is enough, and the fact is terrible. The ships that came behind the Lady Juliana arrived as charnel houses. And here is the thing that binds the 2 arrivals together and makes the second one land with such awful weight. The women of the Lady Juliana were still there. They had come ashore only weeks before and set about beginning their new lives, and now they stood on that same shore and watched the next fleet come in. They watched the boats go out to the great silent ships and come back low in the water with the living and the dead. They saw what a convict transport could be when it was run without mercy, saw it with their own eyes, on the same beach where their own feet had come down safe. whatever any of them had felt about their own long, strange voyage, the confinement, the irons, the label the world would one day hang on them, they now had the truth of it laid out on the sand in front of them, in a form no one could argue with. Because the only real difference between the ships was how the people aboard had been treated. And these women had been treated by the standards of that trade, with something the men on the Neptune were never once shown, with care. Now, I want you to hold those two arrivals side by side, quietly, in the same harbor, only weeks apart. And I want you to feel what happens when you do, not as an argument I am making to you, but as a recognition that rises up on its own. The Lady Juliana, the ship of women, the ship the respectable world sneered at, the ship a distant future would label a floating brothel, had carried her people the long, slow, gentle way around the world, stopping at every green harbor, boiling her kettle of sweet tea twice a day, letting her women wash and sew and go ashore and keep their own clothes and pair off and bear their children with a midwife's hands to catch them. And she had landed nearly every soul alive. The ships that were run the other way, run for profit, run hard and direct, run by men who policed and chained and starved their human cargo and cared nothing for their comfort, those ships arrived as slaughter. Same empire, same system, same crime of transportation, the same distant colony at the end of the same ocean. Two ways of doing the identical thing. And the difference between them, the whole vast difference between a ship that landed her people safe and a ship that tipped a quarter of hers into the sea, came down to nothing grander and nothing smaller than how the people in command chose to treat the people in their power. Think of the men who ran the Lady Juliana. Think of Captain George Aitken, who did everything in his power, Nicholl said, to make the convicts as comfortable as their circumstances would allow, a man who, by the end of the voyage, was himself failing in health, ailing, and who still kept his charge's welfare in front of his own. Think of the agent, Thomas Edgar, who had sailed once with Captain Cook, and who refused to let the women's own clothes be thrown overboard, and who invented a punishment that corked a troublemaker in a flour barrel rather than flaying the skin off her back, a man whose whole instinct was to keep these women whole. Think of the surgeon, Richard Alley, watching over their health, and the fresh food at every port, and the tea, and the clean water, and the child-bed linen. None of these men were saints. They were ordinary officers of an unjust system, and they carried out an unjust sentence. But at every small daily fork in the road, flog or don't flog, dump the clothes or keep them, race ahead or stop for fresh fruit, police the women or let them be, they had chosen, quietly, the humane way. And the sum of all those small choices was a shipload of living people. That is the hardest thing about mercy. When it works, it leaves almost nothing behind to see. The 200 women who walked down onto the shore alive did not look like a miracle. They looked ordinary, tired, blinking in the winter light, unremarkable. Nobody wrote an epic about them, because nothing dramatic had happened to them. They had simply been kept alive by 100 small kindnesses, no one of which was worth recording on its own. It took the arrival of the death ships, weeks later, to reveal what all that quiet care had actually been worth. to show, by horrifying contrast, that keeping 200 helpless people alive across 10 months and the whole width of the world was not the natural order of things at all, but an achievement, a thing that had to be chosen, deliberately, day after day, by men who could have chosen otherwise and lost nothing by it but their own comfort. The women of the Lady Juliana survived because a handful of ordinary men decided, without any reward for it, to treat them as people. That is the whole secret of the ship. It is not a scandalous secret. It is a merciful one. And now you understand, not because anyone told you, but because you have been aboard her for the better part of a year, what the moralists back in England had gotten exactly, perfectly backward. They had looked at the Lady Juliana and seen sin, the pairings, the closeness, the wives who were not wives, the whole warm, improvised domestic life of the ship. They had called that the scandal. But that closeness, that daily insistence on treating the women as people to be kept comfortable rather than cargo to be controlled, that was not the scandal of the ship. That was the reason her people lived. The very intimacy the respectable world clutched its pearls over was, when you set it beside the chained and starving holds of the Neptune, revealed as something close to the opposite of vice. It was mercy. It was the thing that kept death off the ship. And down at the bottom of it all, if you go quiet enough to feel it, is a single, small sound from the very beginning of our story. A hammer and an anvil, and a rivet knocked loose from a woman's ankle by a man who had decided, in that instant, to care what became of her. That was the spirit of this whole ship, struck into being in one small ordinary act below decks in an English river. A shackle taken off, gently, by someone who saw a person where the law had written down a number. Multiply that one gesture by 10 months and 200 women, and a captain and an agent and a surgeon, who all in their different ways chose the same thing, and you get a ship that sailed a cargo of the condemned around the entire world and set them down alive. The world remembered the wrong thing about her. It remembered the scandal and forgot the survival, when the survival and the scandal were the very same fact, seen from two sides. For John Nichol, though, none of this was a matter of numbers, or fleets, or the grim arithmetic of who lived and who died. For John Nichol, the reckoning that mattered was much smaller and much nearer than any fleet. It had a name. It had a face. And it was the whole of what he had. The days fly on eagle's wings. That is how he says it, and in this chapter I want us to stay close to him, in the present tense, in the thing as it happens, because this is the wound of his whole life, and he does not tell it as history. He tells it as a man who is still somewhere inside, standing on that deck. The Lady Juliana is done here. Her convicts are landed, her business at Sydney Cove is finished, and she has her onward orders. She is to sail for China, for the port of Whampoa, to take on a cargo of tea for the long haul home. The ship must go, and John Nichol cannot bear it because Sarah cannot come. He tries. Of course he tries. He goes to the captain and offers to give up his wages, all of them, the whole earnings of the voyage, if only he may be allowed to stay behind here, at the bottom of the world, with Sarah and their son. But the ship is short-handed. She has lost men on the voyage, one left sick at Rio, the carpenter drowned, and she cannot spare a hand, least of all her steward and cooper. The answer is no, and it is not a cruel no, it is worse than cruel. It is merely practical. The ship needs him, and so the ship will have him, and what he needs does not enter into it. He thinks about running. He thinks about stealing her away, the two of them, into the strange land, disappearing. But the women are too closely watched. The Marines guard the convict strictly, and there is no slipping Sarah out from under their eyes. There is no clergyman to marry them, and there are no papers to bind them, and now there are armed men between them, and a ship straining at her anchor, and the whole weight of the world's arrangement pressing down to pry these two people apart. He has been beaten before he began. Everyone has done their duty. No one has done a single wrong thing, and it is going to cost him everything. That is the particular quiet agony of this parting, and it is worth sitting with, because it is a grief many of us know in our own lives, without ever quite having a name for it. There is no villain here. If there were a villain, a cruel captain, a rival, a betrayal, then at least there would be something to rage against, someone to blame, a shape for the anger to take. But there is nothing of the kind. The captain is not cruel, he is simply short of hands. The Marines are not wicked, they are merely doing their duty. The absent clergyman committed no sin by being absent. The ocean is not malicious. The empty purse is not a moral failing. Every single thing keeping John Nickel from Sarah is blameless, reasonable, ordinary, and their sum is a wall he cannot climb. Two people wanted only to be allowed to stay together, and they were kept apart, not by anyone's malice, but by the plain arrangement of the world, by distance and money and law, and the needs of a ship. It is the helplessness of almost, of a happiness that fails, not because anyone struck it down, but because the world simply was not built to let it stand. And there is no one in all of it to forgive, because there is no one to blame. So they do the only thing left to people in their place. They exchange faith. She promises to remain true to him. He promises to come back, to return when her sentence has run its course, and to carry her home to England as his wife, the way he swore he would from the moment the rivet fell from her ankle. And he gives her the one thing he has that is worthy of the promise, his Bible. The Bible that has been the companion of every voyage of his wandering life, the book that has crossed the whole world in his sea chest. He gives it to her with both their names written inside it, her name and his, together, on the flyleaf of the one book he owns. It is the closest thing to a marriage certificate these two will ever have. Two names in one book in her hands. There is a child in this too, his son, born on the voyage, the small warm proof that this was a family and not merely a fondness. He is leaving them both. Not because he wishes to. Not because anything has cooled or failed between them. He is being marched away from his wife and his infant son by armed men at the order of a ship that will not spare one cooper, and there is nothing, not his wages, not his willingness, not his love, that he can put in the scale to change it. He has crossed the whole world by choice, again and again, always the one deciding when to go and when to stay. And now, for the first time, the going is not his to decide. Somebody else's need has reached down and taken the choice out of his hands. And then the Marines drive the crew back aboard, and the anchor comes up, and the Lady Juliana stands out of Sydney Cove and turns her bow toward the north. Picture him at the rail. Picture the shore, drawing back across the widening water, the little raw settlement, the beach, the figure of a woman standing on it with a book in her hands, and a child on her hip, growing smaller. He does not look away. A man does not look away from that. He watches until watching is no longer possible, until the distance he has spent his whole life loving, the wide blue distance that was always his freedom, closes over the one thing he would have given all of it to keep. And then the shore, with Sarah on it, grows smaller and smaller and is gone. He calls the voyage that followed the dullest he ever made. Think about that word from this man in particular, this man who had thrilled to the ice of Greenland and the surf of Hawaii and the great grey seas of Cape Horn, who had spent his whole life unable to sit still because the world was too full of wonders to stay home for. Now, the same wide world had gone flat and grey on him. The Lady Juliana sailed on to China, to the port of Whampoa, to take on her cargo of tea, an exotic destination that the younger Nickel would have drunk in with both eyes, and he barely seems to have seen it. Everything, he says, brought her endearing manners back to his mind. Every ordinary hour of the ship's routine had a hole in it now, shaped exactly like her. A whole ocean of days with nothing in them but her absence. Twice, at Rio, and again at the Cape, on the long way home, he stood at the edge of throwing over everything, of jumping ship and turning back toward the bottom of the world to find her. And each time, the same iron fact stopped him. He had no money. He could not bring her home, even if he reached her. A man cannot rescue anyone on an empty purse. So he sailed on. He sailed on around the world, carrying the shape of her, while she stood on a shore at the bottom of everything, and became, with every mile, further away. Let us stop here a moment, in the ache of it, before we follow him into the years. If this story has reached something in you tonight, if the parting on that deck has put you in mind of a face of your own, someone the current of the world carried out of your reach, then let me leave you with one small, gentle thought before we go on. Somewhere out there is a person you would hate to lose the thread of. A friend drifted a little out of touch, a name you keep meaning to call. When this is over and you are rested, send them something. A story that moved you. This one, even. It is a very small thing to pass a story to someone you don't want to become, a stranger, a far smaller thing than John Nickel was ever granted the chance to do. He would have given his wages, his ship, his whole wandering life, for one more ordinary day within reach of the person he loved. Most of us still have the reach. Use it while it is yours. He spent years trying to close the distance. This is how far he got. The first real news reached him thousands of miles away, on the far side of South America. Years had passed. Nickel had gone on wandering. The sea would not release him, and he found himself at a place called Paita, on the coast of Peru, aboard a whaler, when he fell into talk with a Scotsman who had, by pure chance, some word of the colony at Sydney Cove. And the word was this, that Sarah had left the colony. She was gone from it, the man said, sailed away, bound, he thought, for Bombay, in India. You can watch Nickel's heart break and mend in a single line of his own writing, and it may be the most human sentence in the whole book. Unconstant woman, he cries out first, the flash of hurt, the accusation. And then, in the very same breath, before the anger can even finish forming, he takes it all back, yet dear and never to be forgotten. That is the whole of the man, right there. He blames her for the space of 3 words, and then he forgives her forever. And rather than nurse the grievance, he does the only thing his heart will let him do. He resolves to follow her. To India, if that is where she has gone. Across yet another ocean, to yet another continent, to find her. He never does. This is the slow, quiet tragedy of the back half of John Nickel's life. Not one great blow, but a door closing, and then another, and then another, softly, over many years. He can find no ship bound from England to Bombay. He takes berths that he hopes will carry him nearer to India, and they never quite do. He goes, at last, to Lincoln, to Sarah's own home, to her own parents, and finds that they know even less of her than he does himself. The last word they ever had of their daughter was a letter that he had sent them before he sailed on the whaler. He has become, without meaning to, the keeper of her memory for the very family that bore her. And still he cannot find her. And here is the thing he never knew, the fact that sits under this whole long chase like a stone under still water. While John Nickel was crossing oceans and haunting the docks of India and knocking on a door in Lincoln, Sarah had, in all likelihood, married another man almost the moment his ship sailed out of Sydney Cove. A fellow convict, there, in the colony, a marriage made within days of the Lady Juliana's departure. She had a life to live and a child to keep alive at the bottom of the world, with no way of knowing whether the sailor who swore he would return was alive or dead, or ever coming back. And she did what the living must do, she went on. Whom exactly she married, the records cannot even agree upon, and where the current of her life finally carried her, after she, too, left that colony behind, no one now can say with any certainty at all. Her trail simply goes quiet. I want to be very careful with Sarah here, at the end, because John Nickel was. It would be the easiest thing in the world to make her the villain of his story, the faithless woman who forgot her vow while a good man wore out his life searching. But that is not the truth, and it is not what he believed. She was a young woman, exiled for a borrowed cloak. abandoned on a shore at the end of the earth with an infant and a sentence to serve, and no reason on God's earth to believe rescue was coming. She was not unfaithful. She was surviving on the only terms the world had left her, which is precisely what every woman on that ship had been doing from the very first day. Nickel chased a woman who had already, sensibly, gently, chosen to live. And the tenderness of it, the thing that turns a sailor's lost love into something that can still catch in your throat 200 years later, is that he never once truly held it against her. Dear and never to be forgotten. He kept the promise she could not afford to keep, and he did not resent her for keeping herself alive. Instead, years later, older, a little wealthier from the prize money of the wars, he took stock of the fire that had driven him. And he found that it had gently gone out. The violent desire he had once felt to have her back, he wrote, had softened into a mere curiosity to know what had become of her. He went down to Lincoln one last time to ask, and no one there had heard anything of her in the 9 years since he had last come asking. And so, he wrote, all his inquiries after her ended. He was too old now, he said, for any more love pilgrimages after a single person, when he had no idea in what quarter of the globe she was, or whether she was living or dead. He never saw Sarah again. He never saw his son again. The question we hung in the dark at the very beginning of tonight's story, what became of her, is answered, in the end, only by that he did not know. He went to his grave not knowing. But do not think, for one moment, that this is only a story of loss. Because look what those women became. Remember the child. Remember Mary Wade, the girl of 11 or 12 who had been sentenced to hang and instead was put aboard this ship, one of the youngest human beings England ever exiled. She did not merely survive. She lived to be an old woman, past 80. She married, and she had children, and her children had children, on and on, until by the time she died, she could count her descendants by the 100, and today, 2 centuries on, they number, in the tens of thousands, an entire spreading tree of Australians. Among them, in our own age, a man who would rise to lead the whole nation as its prime minister. A child marked for the gallows for stripping the clothes off another child became a mother of the country. Let that sit beside the word brothel and see which one is the truer name for what these women were. And she is only one. Remember Anne Marsh, transported for a single bushel of wheat, who built herself back up into a respected Sydney shopkeeper running her own passenger boat service. Remember the woman whose married name still lingers today in a suburb of Sydney, carried up out of a convict transport into a whole colonial family and fortune. Remember Mary Rose, the innocent one, the friend who nursed Sarah through her childbed, pardoned at last when the truth came out, sailing home to England, a free and cleared woman with a chest of fine clothes sent by the very magistrates who had once wronged her. Remember Elizabeth Steele, who enters the record as the first deaf Australian whose name we know. Remember even Elizabeth Barnsley, the shoplifter queen, the midwife, 100 years of highwaymen behind her, carrying her strange competence ashore into a new world. Women sent to the ends of the earth for a scrap of muslin, a loaf, a cloak. The throwaway people, the disorderly, the unfortunate, became the grandmothers of a nation. The ship, the moralists, sneered at delivered founders. And what of the man who freed their irons? John Nichol's own life did not grow gentle. The sea kept him, and then the Navy seized him. In the great wars against revolutionary France, the Royal Navy was ravenous for men, and it took them where it found them, by force. The dreaded press gangs sweeping through the ports and hauling experienced sailors aboard the warships, whether they willed it or not. They took John Nichol, and so a middle-aged cooper, who wanted nothing more than a quiet berth on a merchant ship, found himself instead at the guns of a ship of the line, in the thick of some of the most famous battles of the age, at Cape St. Vincent, and again in the roar and smoke and fire of the Battle of the Nile in Aboukir Bay, where he served his cannon through one of the most complete naval victories ever won. Picture him there, no longer young, an old hand among the powder and the wounded, doing his duty in a war he never chose, on a sea that had taken from him the one thing he had ever truly wanted to keep. When at last that service ended, he did not dare come home openly, for fear the press gangs would simply take him again. And so, for years, he lived like a hunted man, moving carefully, keeping out of sight, an aging sailor dodging the very navy he had bled for. Only when the danger finally passed did he come home for good, home to Edinburgh, near the village where he had been born, the wandering, at last, worn all the way out of him. He married a cousin. He tried to take up his trade again. And slowly, as he aged, he sank into poverty, until he was an old man, too worn to work and too proud to beg, keeping himself alive through the hard Edinburgh winters by gathering stray coals off the frozen streets to warm his limbs. He himself had felt the strange premonition of it long before and set it down in words. Little did he think, in his roving prime, that he would one day wander these very streets to pick up a few coals to warm his aged bones. That could so easily have been the end of him, one more poor old man, dead and forgotten in a cold city, and his whole world of memory gone with him into the ground. Every face we have met tonight, Sarah, and the Scottish girl, and Barnsley, and Nance Farrell dancing in her barrel, and the Dorsets weeping on the deck, and the sweet tea, and the struck rivet, all of it lived only inside the head of this one destitute old sailor, and no one had ever thought to write a single word of it down. And then, in 1822, someone did, by nothing more than a chance meeting and a stranger's curiosity. A publisher named John Howell came upon the old man and got to talking with him, and realized what a treasure of a life stood in front of him in rags. Howell drew the whole story out of him patiently and wrote it down and made it into a book, and, in a final act of grace, arranged that the earnings from it should go to Nicol himself. The telling saved him. The memoir found readers, and the small success of it lifted the old sailor out of his want and gave him, in the last few years of his life, a measure of comfort and of peace he had not known in a long time. He did not die a pauper in the snow. He died an old man who had, at the very end, been listened to. and because a stranger stopped to listen, we have every word of it still. They had meant to marry once. There had only been no clergyman aboard. That is where I want to leave them, not on a lesson, for the story has no need of one, but on an image. Somewhere on a shore at the bottom of the world, in the hands of a girl from Lincoln who was only ever trying to live, there was once a sailor's Bible, worn soft with a lifetime of voyages, with 2 names written together inside it. We do not know what became of the book, any more than we know what became of her. But the 2 names were written, and for a little while, on a slow ship in a warm sea, they belonged to each other completely, a wandering man who had never wanted to stay anywhere, and a quiet woman the world had thrown away. The label the world hung on their ship falls away in the end, the way all such labels do when you look long enough at the human faces underneath them. And what is left when it is gone is only this: people who loved and survived and were carried slowly across the whole width of the world on the only terms the world ever gave them. And so the ship comes to rest. Listen one more time for the sound that carried all of them, the long, slow lift and fall of the sea, the same rhythm that rocked more than 200 women towards sleep, night after night across the whole round world. It rocked the newborns in the dark of the hold. It rocked Nance Ferrell in her barrel and Barnsley over her midwife's work, and Sarah with her sailor's son at her breast. It rocked John Nichol through the dullest voyage of his life, and it is rocking still, somewhere out there in the dark, under every ship, on every ocean, tonight. A whole world of lives lived alongside you for a little while. A hammer and an anvil, a borrowed cloak, a ship of the discarded, sailing the long, slow way around the earth and arriving, against every expectation, alive. Let them go gently now. Let the names blur softly into the dark: Sarah and John, and the girl who missed Scotland so much she could not sail, and the child who was meant for the gallows and became the mother of a nation. They are all at rest now, every one of them, and it is time you were too. The sea is rocking. The lamp is low. You have come all this way, and you are safe, and you are here. Rest now. Since you made it this far, I'm glad you enjoyed the episode. If you would like to continue listening to episodes with similar themes, I linked them in the description below. You will also find a playlist of our most popular videos. Sleep now, nightlings. And wake up, as always, a little stronger and a little wiser. The story is done, but yours continues.